At my son's charity gala, I reached for a glass of wine when a young billionaire suddenly grabbed my wrist and lifted my hand for everyone to see. "How do you have that ring?" he demanded. "It belongs to my father." 500 guests turned toward me as whispers of thief spread across the ballroom. I looked him straight in the eyes and asked, "Who is your father?" His answer made the music stop, the room fall silent, and my own son turned frighteningly pale. "I am so grateful you are here with me today." Before we begin, drop a comment and tell me where in the world are you watching from. Your city, your country, I would love to know. This story contains fictional elements crafted for storytelling and educational purposes. Any similarity to names or places is coincidental, but the message it carries is worth your time. The invitation had my son's name on it, not mine. I want to be honest about that from the start, because the truth of that one small detail explains everything that followed. Preston Caldwell, Chief Financial Officer of Apex Capital, had organized this charity fundraiser at the Plaza Hotel, one of the most storied addresses in all of Manhattan. 500 guests, black tie, crystal chandeliers casting golden light across a ballroom that smelled of old money and fresh flowers. And somewhere in the middle of all that elegance there was me. Everett Caldwell, 60 years old, retired geological engineer, widower wearing a rented tuxedo that fit me the way a borrowed life fits a man who used to have his own. Preston had called me 2 days before the event. I remember the exact flatness in his voice when he said, "Dad, there's a charity gala Friday night. You should come. It would look good." Not "I want you there." Not "I'd love for you to meet the people I work with." Just "it would look good." I told myself it was a son's way of showing love. I was 60 years old and still telling myself things like that. I took the train from Carroll Gardens, Brooklyn, because I didn't want to deal with parking, and because men like me had always taken the train. The doorman at the plaza gave me a look not rude, just assessing the kind of look that takes in a rented tuxedo in under 2 seconds. I straightened my jacket and walked through anyway. The ballroom was everything I expected, and nothing I belonged to. Women in evening gowns moved through the crowd like slow-moving ships. Men in perfectly tailored suits spoke in the low, confident tones of people who had never once doubted their own importance. I found the bar and ordered a glass of red wine, mostly to have something to do with my hands. That was when I saw Preston. He was standing with a small group near the center of the room, laughing at something, his hand resting on the shoulder of a colleague. Every inch the successful man he had spent 35 years becoming. His wife Renata stood beside him in a deep burgundy gown, her dark hair swept up her expression, carrying that particular coolness she had worn around me for the past 3 years. She spotted me first. I watched something flicker across her face, not surprise, more like the recognition of an inconvenience, and then she leaned toward Preston and said something close to his ear. Preston turned. He saw me, and for just a moment, half a second, maybe less, I saw it. Not embarrassment. Not the warmth of a son who is glad his father came. What I saw in my son's eyes in that fraction of a second was calculation. A quick, practiced measurement of how my presence would land in a room full of people who mattered to him. Then the moment passed, and he smiled. "Dad," he said, crossing toward me with his arms slightly open, performing an embrace without fully committing to one. "You made it." "You invited me," I said. "I did." He straightened my lapel, and I understood immediately that it was not a gesture of affection. He was adjusting me the way you adjust a piece of furniture that is slightly out of place. "Enjoy yourself. The hors d'oeuvres are excellent. Just try not to corner anyone, all right? These are business contacts." He was gone before I could answer. I stood there holding my wine glass and thought about my wife Eleanor, who had died 4 years ago and who would have taken my hand at exactly that moment and said something that made everything feel less sharp. But Eleanor was gone, and I was standing alone in a ballroom I hadn't been invited to so much as deployed to, so I did what any reasonable man of 60 does in an uncomfortable situation. I went looking for a quiet corner and another glass of wine. I had just reached the bar and stretched out my hand toward a fresh glass when someone grabbed my wrist. Not tapped, not touched. Grabbed with the sudden focused grip of a person who has just seen something that stopped their heart. I turned. The young man holding my wrist was perhaps 30 years old, with sharp features and dark eyes that were fixed not on my face but on my hand. My left hand. More precisely, on the ring on my left hand. It was a simple band of silver worn smooth by decades of wear, with a small geometric pattern etched along its surface, a pattern that looked, if you knew what you were looking at, like the cross-section of a geological formation. A stratum. Layers of earth pressed into metal. I had worn that ring for 40 years. I had stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing your own heartbeat. The young man raised my hand, actually raised it, held it up between us in the light of the chandelier, and his voice, when it came, was loud enough that the people nearest to us turned to look. "How do you have this ring?" he demanded. "This ring belongs to my father." The nearest conversations stopped. Heads turned. I felt the attention of the room shift toward us the way water shifts in a tilted glass slowly, then all at once. From somewhere in the crowd, low but audible, I caught a single word moving mouth to mouth among people who could not yet know what they were looking at. "Thief." "I beg your pardon," I said because it was the most dignified response I could locate. "This ring." His jaw was tight, his eyes burning with something between fury and grief. "I have seen photographs of this exact ring my entire life. My father wore it every day until the day he disappeared. So I am asking you, how do you have it? Where did you get it?" From somewhere to my left, I heard Preston's voice cut through the murmur. "Sir, I don't know what you think you're doing, but that is my father, and I would appreciate—" "I'm not talking to you," the young man said, and the quiet authority in his voice stopped Preston mid-sentence. He looked back at me. His hand was still around my wrist, but the grip had changed, less accusatory now, more desperate, as though he was afraid that if he let go, the answer would disappear. "Please," he said, and the single word carried more weight than anything else spoken in that room all evening. "Just tell me, where did you get this ring?" I looked at him, really looked at him, and something moved in my chest that I had not felt in a very long time. A recognition without a name. Like hearing a piece of music you learned as a child and thought you had forgotten. "Who is your father?" I asked. The young man straightened. His voice dropped to something that was almost reverent. "His name was Edmund Harlow," he said. "He was an architect and engineer. He disappeared when I was 2 years old. Everyone told me he was dead." The wine glass slipped in my other hand. I caught it barely. Edmund Harlow. I had not heard that name spoken aloud in 4 decades. And now here it was in the middle of the grand ballroom of the Plaza Hotel, coming from the mouth of a young man with Edmund's jaw and Edmund's eyes. A young man I had never met, but who I suddenly understood with a certainty that bypassed logic entirely was the child Edmund had told me about in a mine shaft in upstate New York in the autumn of 1984. My throat tightened until speaking felt like pushing words through concrete. "Edmund," I said, and my voice cracked on the second syllable. "Edmund is he still alive?" Something shifted in the young man's expression. The anger drained out of it, replaced by confusion, and then by something cautious and watchful. "That," he said carefully, "is a very interesting question for a man wearing his ring to ask." Around us, 500 people were watching. Preston was frozen 3 feet away, the color gone from his face in a way that I would later realize was not shock at all. It was the pale, precise recognition of a man watching something he had tried to prevent arrive anyway. Renata had taken a small step backward, as though distancing herself from something she had anticipated. The young man, Beckett Harlow, CEO of Harlow Technologies, 30 years old and worth $1.7 billion. Though I knew none of that yet, released, my wrist straightened his jacket and said in a voice pitched for my ears only, "Sir, I think we need to talk, not here." He gestured toward the corridor that led to the hotel's quieter eastern wing. I looked once at Preston, who met my gaze with an expression I could not read and did not try to. And then I set my wine glass down on the nearest tray and followed the son of the man I thought I had lost forever out of the most elegant room I had ever been unwelcome in. The corridor east of the grand ballroom smelled of carpet cleaner and cut flowers, a combination that somehow made everything feel more real than the performance happening 50 feet behind us. Beckett walked quickly, his hands in his jacket pockets, his shoulders carrying a tension that hadn't released since the moment he grabbed my wrist. I followed him past a row of framed photographs, old Manhattan skylines, sepia-toned and dignified, and through a set of glass doors that opened onto Fifth Avenue. The September night hit me like a clean sentence after a long paragraph. Cool air, the low roar of traffic moving north, the distant sound of a carriage horse somewhere near Central Park. Beckett stopped at the edge of the sidewalk and turned to face me under the yellow wash of a street lamp. For a long moment, we simply stood there. Two strangers on Fifth Avenue, with 40 years of history, neither of us fully understood, sitting between us like an unopened letter. "How long have you worn that ring?" Beckett asked. His voice had lost the sharp edge from the ballroom. What replaced it was something more careful, more fragile. "Since 1984, I said. "October. I was 20 years old." His breath came out in a slow, controlled exhale. "That's the year he disappeared." "I know," I said. "I was there." Beckett's head came up sharply. His dark eyes searched my face with an intensity that reminded me of something the way a geologist looks at a rock formation, reading layers that took centuries to build. "You were there when the explosion happened. I was the one who pulled him out." The words landed between us with the weight of something that had been waiting 4 decades to be said aloud. Beckett took one step backward, then steadied himself against the low stone wall bordering the hotel entrance. His jaw worked for a moment before sound came out. "Everyone told me he died," he said. "My mother, the company, the official report." His voice cracked on the last word, a hairline fracture in an otherwise composed man. "I grew up visiting an empty grave, Mr. Caldwell," I said. "Everett Caldwell." Something moved across his face. "You were his partner on the Adirondack survey." "His partner and his closest friend," I said, and my chest ached saying it because it was true and because I had not said it to anyone in so long that the words felt newly minted. Edmund Harlow was the best man I ever worked alongside. We spent 14 months on that geological survey together, living out of the same equipment trailer in the mountains, eating terrible food, arguing about everything from rock classifications to baseball. I paused. He was also the man who carried me 300 yards through a collapsing mine shaft when I broke my ankle in the explosion. I pulled him out, but he got me out first. Beckett pressed one hand flat against the stone wall as though he needed something solid to hold on to. "Then why—" He stopped, gathered himself. "Why did everyone say he was dead? Why is there a grave with his name on it in Greenwich, Connecticut?" "I don't know," I said honestly. After the explosion, Edmund was taken by emergency services. I was hospitalized for 6 weeks, the ankle, and a concussion that was worse than the doctors initially thought. When I tried to contact Edmund after I was discharged, I was told he had died from injuries sustained in the collapse. My voice dropped. I believed it. I had no reason not to, But you kept the ring. He gave it to me before we went into that shaft, I said. We exchanged rings. It was something we'd agreed on, half as a joke and half because we were 20 years old and felt invincible and sentimental in equal measure. He took mine. I took his. We made a promise. I looked down at the silver band on my finger at the geological striations etched into its surface. If one of us didn't come back, the other would find a way to keep that person's family whole. We meant it the way young men mean things completely, without understanding what it costs. Beckett was watching me with an expression that I felt rather than saw, something raw and searching, moving behind his eyes. You never tried to find his family. The question hit me somewhere undefended. I tried, I said. In 1986, I tracked down an address in Connecticut. I wrote a letter. I never received a reply. I exhaled. I assumed his wife wanted nothing to do with anyone connected to what happened. I didn't push. Maybe I should have pushed. I pressed my lips together. Maybe that was a failure I've been carrying without fully naming it. Beckett reached into his jacket pocket and produced his phone. He turned the screen toward me, a photograph, old and slightly yellowed, of a man in his late 20s, standing at the mouth of a mine, squinting into the sun, wearing a silver ring on his left hand. My knees went soft under me. I put one hand against the wall. The man in the photograph was Edmund Harlow, older than I remembered him, but unmistakably Edmund, the sharp jaw, the precise posture, the way he stood as though he was about to say something important. This was taken 3 years ago, Beckett said quietly. He's alive, Mr. Caldwell. He's been living in Edinburgh, Scotland for the past 38 years. He left voluntarily, or he was made to leave. I'm still trying to understand which. His voice dropped further. I found him 8 months ago. We've spoken 6 times. He has never stopped talking about a man named Everett. My throat closed completely. I could feel my eyes burning, and I did not fight it, because some things deserve to be felt without armor. He left something, Beckett continued. A message. He told me that if I ever found a man wearing a silver ring with a geological pattern, specifically this pattern, he pointed to the etching on my finger. I was to give that man a specific address and tell him that the promise is not finished. The traffic moved on Fifth Avenue. A cab blew its horn 2 blocks north. Somewhere above us, 500 people were eating elegant appetizers and talking about money. And I was standing on a sidewalk, at 60 years old, learning that the man I had mourned for 40 years had been alive the entire time, and that he had been waiting in whatever way a person waits across an ocean, and 4 decades for me to find my way back to him. What address? I managed. Beckett looked at me with his father's eyes. That, he said carefully, is only the first part of what he asked me to tell you. The second part, the part that I think you need to hear sitting down, involves why my father left, and what he found in that mine before the explosion happened. I did not sleep. I lay on my back in the dark of my bedroom in Carroll Gardens, and watched the ceiling, and thought about a man I had buried in my memory 38 years ago, who had apparently been sitting in Edinburgh this whole time, breathing, aging, thinking about a geological map. At some point around 3 in the morning, I got up, went to the kitchen, and made coffee I didn't need, because doing something with my hands felt better than doing nothing with my thoughts. My kitchen is small and honest, the kind of room that accumulates the proof of a life lived alone. A single coffee mug on the drying rack. 1 plate. A reading chair pulled close to the window that looks out onto the backyard, where Eleanor's rose bushes still grew every spring with a stubbornness I had always privately admired. I sat in that chair with my coffee and my ring and 40 years of questions and waited for the morning. Beckett had texted me at 11 the previous night before I even made it home. The message was brief. I've spoken to him. He knows. He wants to call you at 8:30 tomorrow morning. He's been awake since I told him. His words were, "Tell Everett I am sorry it took this long." I read that message 4 times on the subway home. By the 4th time, my hands were trembling around the phone. At 8:27 a.m., I opened my laptop on the kitchen table and pulled up the video call link Beckett had forwarded. My coffee had gone cold. The morning light was coming in sideways through the window, catching the dust motes above the table and making them look briefly like something intentional. At 8:30 exactly, the call connected. The face that appeared on my screen was older. Of course it was older. We were both older. That was 40 years of living written across a man's features, but it was unmistakably Edmund Harlow. The same sharp jaw now softened by age. The same direct gaze, though the eyes behind it carried a weight they hadn't held when we were young. His hair had gone fully white. He was sitting in what looked like a study, crowded with books and architectural drawings, a window behind him showing the gray Edinburgh morning. For a full 3 seconds, neither of us could produce a single word. Then Edmund pressed both hands flat on his desk, leaned toward the camera, and his voice, older, accented now with something faintly British from nearly 4 decades abroad, came through the speakers. "Everett," he said. Just my name. But the way he said it, like a man setting down something he had carried for an unbearably long time, broke something open in my chest. "Edmund." My voice came out rougher than I intended. "You absolute fool. You let me think you were dead for 40 years. Edmund laughed, a short, fractured sound that was half grief and half genuine amusement. I know, and I am sorry. I have rehearsed this apology for decades, and now that you're in front of me, every version of it sounds completely inadequate." "It is inadequate," I said, and my eyes were burning badly, now the kind of burn you can't blink away. "It is completely inadequate, and I accept it anyway. You idiot. You brilliant, infuriating idiot." Edmund pressed one hand over his mouth for a moment. When he lowered it, his eyes were wet. "You look old," he said. "You look older," I said. And somehow, impossibly, we both laughed. The laugh of two men who have just found something they had resigned themselves to never finding again, and don't quite know what to do with the relief of it. But the laughter faded because it had to, because there were things that needed to be said that had nothing to do with reunion. "Tell me," I said. "Tell me everything. Why did you leave? Why did you let them say you were dead?" Edmund's expression shifted, the warmth remaining, but something harder moving underneath it, like bedrock beneath topsoil. "Do you remember what we found in the Adirondack survey?" he asked. "In the lower strata, Section 7 of the eastern shaft. Rare earth deposits," I said immediately. The memory was 40 years old, but perfectly preserved. "Significant concentration. We flagged it in the preliminary report as requiring further analysis." "We did," Edmund said. "What we didn't know, what I didn't fully understand until after the explosion, was that the land above those deposits had already been optioned by a development company for a $340 million real estate project." He paused. "A project backed by a man named Reginald Stowe." The name landed in my kitchen like something dropped from a great height. "Stowe Corp," I said slowly. "Reginald Stowe, chairman of Stowe Corp." Edmund's voice was measured, now the voice of a man who has had decades to organize his anger into something precise. He knew about our survey. His people had access to the preliminary data, and he understood that if our final report confirmed significant rare earth deposits now valued by current estimates at somewhere around $2.4 billion, his real estate project was finished. The land would be reclassified. The permits would be revoked. Everything he had invested would be worthless. My coffee cup was cold in my hands. "So he had the mind blown." "He had the mind blown," Edmund confirmed. "I found the evidence 3 days before the explosion. A memo, physical paper, not digital. This was 1984, in the site supervisor's files. It outlined a plan to terminate the geological assessment and listed Stowe Corp as the authorizing party." His jaw tightened visibly. "I was going to bring it to the Federal Geological Survey Board. I made the mistake of telling the site supervisor I intended to do so. And 3 days later, the mine collapsed," I said. 3 days later, the mine collapsed. Edmund exhaled. When I came out of the hospital, a man came to see me. He didn't give his name. He told me very calmly that if I filed any report, if I said anything to anyone about what I had found, my family would be in danger. He mentioned Beckett by name. My son was 2 years old, Everett. The kitchen felt very quiet around me. "So you disappeared," I said. "So I disappeared," Edmund said. "I staged enough of a paper trail to let the death story hold, took my family to Edinburgh under my wife's maiden name, and spent 38 years being grateful that Beckett was alive and hating myself for what it cost." His voice thickened. "I kept one thing from that mine. One thing I never destroyed, because I told myself that someday, if the world changed enough, it might matter." I sat forward in my chair. "The geological map," I said. Edmund met my gaze through 4,000 miles of fiber optic cable. "The original survey map," he said. "Section 7, the Eastern Shaft, signed by both of us, dated October 1984, with the full mineral analysis notation." He paused. "It proves the deposit existed. It proves Stocorp knew about it. And it proves the explosion was not an accident." My pulse was loud in my ears. "Where is it?" Edmund's expression shifted, and for just a moment something moved behind his eyes that was not reunion or grief or relief. It was fear. Old fear, carefully managed, but still very much alive. "That," he said, "is something I will not say on a video call. But Everett, there is something else you need to know." He leaned closer to the camera. "Someone has been looking for that map for 40 years, and in the past 6 months since Beckett found me, the looking has become considerably more urgent." The rose bushes in the backyard swayed in the September morning wind. Eleanor had planted them the year we moved in 31 years ago because she said a house needed something living that wasn't people. I looked at the ring on my finger and understood, in the marrow of my bones, that the promise Edmund and I had made in a mine shaft in 1984 was not finished. It was in fact only just beginning. The day had been too large for any single person to carry, and by the time evening settled over Carroll Gardens, I had stopped trying. I had spent the hours after Edmund's call doing the things a man does when his understanding of the past 40 years has been quietly dismantled. I walked to the end of my block and back 3 times. I ate half a sandwich I didn't taste. I sat in Eleanor's reading chair until the light changed and the room went gray. Beckett had texted twice to check on me. I replied both times with, "I'm fine," which was the kind of thing you say when you are very much not fine, but cannot yet locate the right words for what you actually are. By midnight, the neighborhood had gone quiet in the particular way that Carroll Gardens goes quiet, not the aggressive silence of emptiness, but the settled breathing quiet of a place where people have genuinely gone to sleep. Row houses with their lights off, the occasional car moving slowly down the street, a dog barking somewhere on the next block, then stopping. I was at my desk in the small room I used as a study, what had been Eleanor's sewing room before she died, and what had become in the years since a room where I kept my books and my old professional files, and the particular kind of organized disorder that accumulates when a man lives alone for too long. I was trying to write down everything Edmund had told me because I have always been a man who trusts paper more than memory, when I noticed the cardboard box on the second shelf. It had been moved. I know this the way I know the geography of my own hands intimately, without needing to think about it. That box had sat in the same position on that shelf for 11 years. Eleanor had labeled it in her neat slanted handwriting, Everett Professional Records, 1980 to 1995. I had not opened it in 4 years. It sat 2 inches from the right edge of the shelf, angled slightly, so that the label faced outward. Now it was flush against the left side label facing inward. I stood up slowly from my desk. I told myself there was a reasonable explanation. I told myself I must have moved it myself at some point and forgotten. I am 60 years old, and I live alone, and sometimes things get moved without a clear memory of moving them. I told myself this with great conviction, while my skin prickled from my shoulders to my wrists. I crossed to the shelf and opened the box. The files inside were intact, nothing visibly removed, but they had been leafed through. I could tell because I am a geological engineer, and we are by professional habit precise people. I filed everything in chronological order, oldest at the back. The 1984 Adirondack Survey correspondence letters, field notes, equipment requisitions was now at the front. Someone had been looking for something specific, and they had known exactly which years to look in. My phone rang, and I came very close to dropping it. Rita's name was on the screen, my sister, 58 years old, who lived 20 minutes away in Park Slope, and who called me every Sunday without fail, and almost never on a Friday night past midnight. "Rita," I answered. "Everett." Her voice was tight in a way I recognized immediately. Rita, who had raised 2 children and managed a high school library for 25 years, was not a woman who frightened easily. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to answer me honestly. Have you been having problems with anyone lately? Anyone official, unofficial, I don't care. Anyone paying unusual attention to you?" I looked at my displaced box of files. "Why are you asking me this at midnight?" "Because I drove past your house an hour ago. I was coming back from Aunt Patricia's dinner, and your street was on the way, and there was a car parked directly across from your front door that was there when I passed at 9 o'clock, and still there when I passed again at 11. Her voice dropped. "Everett, it was running, just sitting there with the engine on for 2 hours outside your house." The prickling across my skin sharpened into something colder. "What kind of car?" "Dark. A sedan. I think I didn't get the plate because I didn't think fast enough, and I'm angry at myself for that. But it was gone by the time I circled back around, which was maybe 15 minutes ago." A pause. "Everett, what is going on? You sound the way Dad used to sound when something was wrong, and he didn't want us to know." I sat down on the edge of my desk chair. The study felt different now, the familiar room with the familiar books and the familiar smell of old paper and coffee had taken on a quality I couldn't name, something watchful and altered, as though the room itself had been touched by someone else's intentions. "Something happened last night," I said carefully. "At Preston's charity event. I met someone, a young man who recognized my ring. His father was my partner on the Adirondack Survey in 1984. "Edmund Harlow." Rita's voice sharpened. "You told me about him. You said he died in the explosion." "He didn't die," I said. "He's been alive in Edinburgh for 38 years. We spoke this morning." I paused. "Rita, the explosion in 1984 wasn't an accident. There are people who have reasons, significant financial reasons, to make sure certain information from that survey never becomes public." The silence on the line had weight to it. Then Rita said very quietly, "Everett, are you safe right now? Are you in your—" The call dropped. Not the gradual degradation of a weak signal, an abrupt clean cut. One moment her voice, the next moment nothing. I looked at my phone. Full bars. Wi-Fi connected. The call had not simply failed. I stood up from the chair and walked to the front window of the study, staying close to the wall, the way you instinctively do when you are not sure who might be looking in. The street outside was quiet and dark, and appeared in every visible way completely normal. But the box on my shelf had been moved, and Eleanor's letter was still sitting where I had found it, tucked behind the 1984 files, in a plain white envelope with my name on it, in her handwriting, sealed, marked in the corner in her careful script, "Open when you are ready to understand." I had found it tonight for the first time, which meant either she had hidden it there long ago, and I had simply never looked deeply enough, or someone in going through my files had placed it where I would find it. I did not know which possibility frightened me more. I sat back down in Eleanor's chair, held the unopened envelope in both hands, and listened to the absolute quiet of a house that no longer felt entirely mine. I want to be clear about something before I tell you what happened inside the offices of Apex Capital. On the morning of September 16th, I was not there. Everything I am about to recount came to me later pieced together from Renata's testimony, from phone records subpoenaed during the federal investigation, and from security footage that a federal prosecutor described to me in a conference room 4 months after these events. I am telling it, as I came to understand it, in the order it became clear to me because that is the only honest way I know to tell a story. The offices of Apex Capital occupied the 42nd floor of One World Trade Center, which is the kind of address that functions as a statement before anyone in the room has said a word. Floor-to-ceiling glass on 3 sides. Lower Manhattan spread out below like a circuit board. The Hudson River catching the morning light to the west. It is the kind of office that is designed to make you feel that the people inside it operate at an altitude the rest of the world cannot reach. Preston arrived at 7:45 that Monday morning, 45 minutes before anyone else on his floor. Renata told the federal investigators later that this was unusual. Preston was rarely in before 9, and never voluntarily. He went directly to his private office, closed the door, and made a phone call that lasted 11 minutes. The call was to Reginald Stowe. Reginald Stowe, 70 years old, chairman and majority shareholder of Stowe Corp., with declared assets of $8.9 billion and a reputation in Manhattan real estate circles that had been carefully polished for 5 decades, was not a man who took early morning calls from CFOs of mid-sized investment firms unless the subject matter justified it. The fact that he took Preston's call on the first ring told Renata everything she needed to know about the nature of their relationship once she understood what she was looking at. "It happened at the party," Preston said. The phone records captured only his side of the conversation, but the federal investigators were skilled at reconstructing the other half. Harlow's kid recognized the ring. They spoke privately. "I don't know everything they said, but Harlow left with my father, and they were outside for almost 30 minutes. A pause while Stowe responded. "I understand that," Preston said, his voice dropping lower. "But if the old man starts talking, if Harlow's kid has already told him things, then the timeline accelerates. We need to move on the guardianship before he has a chance to—" Another pause. "Yes. The doctor in White Plains is prepared. The paperwork can be filed by end of week." Renata was at her own desk in the open-plan area outside Preston's office, close enough to hear the low murmur of his voice through the glass partition, but not the words. She told the investigators she had noticed him arrive early and thought nothing of it. What drew her attention was a different sound, not the phone call, but what happened after it ended. Preston opened his laptop. He typed quickly with the focused energy of a man executing a plan rather than formulating one. Then he stepped away from his desk to refill his coffee from the kitchen at the far end of the floor. He left his laptop open. Renata, who later described this moment to the federal investigators with the particular precision of someone who has rehearsed their honesty, said she was not looking for anything. She was walking past his office door, which he had left slightly ajar, and she saw the screen. More specifically, she saw the subject line of an email draft sitting open on his display. 4 words. Re-accelerating the Caldwell matter. She did not read the body of the email. She said later that she didn't need to, that 4 words were sufficient to understand that the man she had built a life with was doing something that went beyond aggressive business strategy, beyond the kind of calculated maneuvering she had watched him deploy for 3 years and told herself was simply ambition. This was something with her father-in-law's name in the subject line of a draft that was clearly not the first correspondence in a thread. She took out her phone. She photographed the screen. Then she walked back to her desk, sat down, opened her own work files, and spent the rest of the morning performing the ordinary tasks of her job with a steadiness that she told me later, when we eventually spoke months after all of this had concluded, cost her more effort than anything she had ever done. Preston came back from the kitchen, returned to his office, closed his laptop, and spent the remainder of the morning in back-to-back meetings with Apex Capital's investment committee. He was charming in those meetings. He was always charming. That was something Renata had once loved about him, and had gradually come to understand was not charm at all. It was the practiced fluency of a man who had learned very early that warmth deployed correctly is simply another instrument of control. At 12:30, Preston left for a lunch that was not on his calendar. The restaurant was a private dining room at the Yale Club on Vanderbilt Avenue, a location I would come to know well in the months ahead, though, for very different reasons. His lunch companion, confirmed later by the club's reservation records, was Reginald Stowe. They were there for 90 minutes. I do not know everything that was said over that lunch, but I know what was decided because the consequences of those decisions arrived at my door in Carroll Gardens 11 days later, on a Friday night in late September, in a way that left bruises I could photograph. What I know for certain is this: when Preston left that lunch and walked back out onto Vanderbilt Avenue into the bright September noon, he had a plan, and that plan had my name at the center of it. The papers arrived on a Wednesday morning, tucked inside a standard legal envelope with a Manhattan return address I didn't recognize. I was in the kitchen when the mail slot clicked, the particular sound it makes when something thicker than a bill is being pushed through. I set down my coffee and walked to the front door and picked up the envelope from the mat, and I remember thinking before I opened it that it felt wrong in my hands. Too deliberate. Too square. The kind of envelope that contains something someone has spent time preparing. I opened it at the kitchen table. The document inside was 31 pages long, printed on heavy legal stock, with the heading of the New York State Supreme Court guardianship part printed across the top in formal type. Below that, in language that was precise and clinical and utterly devastating, in the matter of the application for appointment of guardian of the person and property of Everett James Caldwell, an alleged incapacitated person. I read it 3 times. Then I sat very still with my hands flat on the table and my coffee going cold beside me, and tried to locate some part of myself that was not shaking. The petition had been filed by Preston Caldwell, identified as the petitioner and proposed guardian. It alleged that I suffered from significant cognitive decline, including disorientation, impaired judgment, and inability to manage my own financial affairs. It cited a medical evaluation dated August 28, 2024, 2 weeks before the gala performed by a Dr. Gerald Whitson of the Whitson Neurological Institute in White Plains, New York. The evaluation concluded in 3 pages of clinical language that I posed a risk to my own welfare if left without supervised care. I had never been to White Plains in my life. I had never met anyone named Gerald Whitson. I had not had a neurological evaluation of any kind in the past 3 years, and my last full physical at NYU Langone in March had returned results my doctor described as impressively unremarkable for a man your age. I called my sister Rita first because she answered faster than anyone I knew. She picked up on the second ring. "He filed guardianship papers on me," I said. A pause of about 2 seconds, and then Rita's voice came back so sharp it could have cut glass. "He did what?" 31 pages. Cognitive incapacity. A doctor I have never heard of. Filed before the gala. Rita, the evaluation date is August 28th. That means he was planning this before Beckett Harlow ever touched your hand. Her voice was vibrating with a fury she was visibly working to contain. "Everett, you need a lawyer. Today. Not tomorrow, not after you think about it, today." Gordon Fitch came to me by way of Beckett Harlow, who, when I called him that same Wednesday morning, in a state I can only describe as barely controlled outrage, made 3 phone calls in the time it took me to put my shoes on, and had an address on West 57th Street ready for me before I reached the subway. Gordon Fitch, 55 years old, with the deliberate, unhurried manner of a man who has seen every variety of legal malice and remains unimpressed by all of it, met me in a third-floor office that smelled of old case files and strong tea. He was tall, angular, with reading glasses. He wore pushed up on his forehead and a habit of tapping his pen against his legal pad when he was thinking hard about something. He took the 31 pages from me, told me to sit down, and read the entire petition without a word. When he finished, he set it down and tapped his pen twice against the pad. "The doctor," he said. "Gerald Whitson, Whitson Neurological Institute, White Plains." "I've never met him," I said. "I know you haven't," Gordon said. He turned his laptop toward me. On the screen was the New York State Office of the Profession's Medical License Registry, the official government database of every licensed physician in the state of New York. The search field contained the name Gerald Whitson. The results field was empty. There is no Gerald Whitson licensed to practice medicine in the state of New York. There is no Whitson Neurological Institute registered as a medical facility anywhere in Westchester County or in New York State at all. He took his glasses off his forehead and put them on properly, peering at me over the frames. "What your son has filed with the Supreme Court is a petition supported by a fabricated medical evaluation from a doctor who does not legally exist. The word fraud is a legal term with specific meaning. It means the deliberate misrepresentation of facts to obtain something of value. What Preston had done, presenting a forged medical evaluation to a court of law to support a petition to strip his father of legal autonomy, was not merely fraud. It was fraud upon the court, a category of offense that judges take with a particular and personal seriousness because it is an attack on the integrity of the judicial system itself. Gordon filed an emergency response with the court that same afternoon. Judge Patricia Howe, 62 years old, 20 years on the Manhattan bench, with a reputation among the city's legal community for a forensic intolerance of procedural dishonesty, reviewed the response and scheduled an emergency hearing for the following Friday. I was leaving Gordon's office when he called me back. "One more thing," he said, holding up a single sheet of paper that had been tucked at the back of the petition documents, behind the medical evaluation, behind the financial affidavits filed so quietly it might have been mistaken for a routine attachment. "This came in with the petition. It's a power of attorney draft." He held it out. "It's dated August 7th, 3 weeks before the fake medical evaluation. 3 weeks before any of this officially started." He looked at me steadily. "Everett, someone wasn't reacting to what happened at the gala. Someone had been building this for months." I took the paper from his hand. My son's signature was at the bottom, clean, confident, the signature of a man who had not anticipated anyone looking closely enough to find the date. The room felt very small around me. Outside West 57th Street moved past the window in its ordinary afternoon way, cabs, pedestrians, the city, doing what the city does regardless of what is happening to any particular person inside any particular building. I folded the paper carefully and put it in my jacket pocket, and I thought about the man who had adjusted my lapel at the plaza 8 days ago as though I were furniture he needed to straighten. What I am about to tell you I did not witness. I want to be precise about that. The way a man trained in geological survey is precise about the difference between what the instruments confirm and what the eye merely suggests. Everything in this part of the story came to me from Renata herself, in a conversation that took place weeks later in a room that smelled of institutional coffee and fluorescent lighting. She told it to me slowly, in the careful, methodical way of someone who has decided that honesty at this particular stage of her life is the only thing left worth practicing. She began by telling me about the safe. It was a compact steel safe bolted to the floor of the walk-in closet in the master bedroom of the apartment she and Preston shared on the 14th floor of a building on East 74th Street. A building with a doorman, a gym, and monthly maintenance fees that Renata had once found reassuring, and now understood as just another layer of insulation between Preston and consequence. She knew the combination. She had always known it. Preston had given it to her 3 years ago when they moved in, presenting it as a gesture of transparency, and she had filed it away in her memory and never used it the way you keep a spare key to a room you never need to enter. She entered it on the afternoon of Friday, September 20th, the same afternoon, though she did not know this yet, that I was sitting in Gordon Fitch's office on West 57th Street folding a power of attorney draft into my jacket pocket. She had spent 4 days since photographing Preston's email screen, trying to talk herself out of what she already knew. She had tried logic, telling herself that accelerating the Caldwell matter might refer to something administrative, something she had misunderstood. She had tried loyalty, reminding herself of the man Preston had been when she first met him, the focused, driven, genuinely brilliant man who had quoted Steinbeck on their 3rd date and made her believe that ambition and depth could coexist in the same person. She had tried exhaustion, simply working until she was too tired to think about it. None of it held. She opened the safe on a Friday afternoon, when Preston was at the courthouse for what he believed was a routine preliminary guardianship hearing. Her hands were trembling slightly as she turned the dial, not from guilt, she told me later, but from the particular physical dread of a person who understands that what they are about to find will permanently alter the architecture of their life. The safe contained 4 items. The first was a manila envelope containing $15,000 in cash, which Renata set aside without comment, because it was the least surprising thing in the safe. The second was a rolled document, a photocopy, not an original printed on plain paper, but with handwritten notations in margins that she did not recognize as Preston's handwriting. When she unrolled it fully on the bedroom floor, she found herself looking at a geological survey map, section references, elevation markings, a grid notation she didn't understand professionally, but which she photographed carefully from every angle because she understood instinctively that it mattered. The third item was a bound set of financial documents, 12 pages paper-clipped together, headed with the name of a private arbitration service she had never heard of. It took her 8 minutes of reading to understand what she was looking at. Preston owed $4.2 million to a series of entities' private gaming debts accumulated over 4 years at high-stakes tables in Atlantic City, and on 2 occasions in rooms she could only identify as operating outside any regulatory framework. The debts were held by 3 different shell companies. All 3, when she photographed the registration details and sent them to Cecily Drummond, her personal attorney, and one of the sharpest legal minds in the city, were confirmed within the hour to be subsidiaries of a parent holding company registered in Delaware. The parent holding company was called Redwood Consulting, LLC. Cecily told her in a text message that arrived while Renata was still sitting on the bedroom floor that Redwood Consulting, LLC shared a registered agent and a business address with a division of Stowe Corp. The fourth item in the safe was a contract, 12 pages, signed by Preston Caldwell and countersigned by a representative of Redwood Consulting, LLC, dated March 14, 2024. 6 months before the gala, 6 months before any of this had broken into the open. The contract's language was elaborate and carefully euphemistic, the kind of legal prose designed to mean something specific while appearing to mean something general. But its core arrangement, as Cecily translated it for Renata in a phone call that lasted 40 minutes, was this in exchange for the forgiveness of Preston's $4.2 million gambling debt. Preston agreed to facilitate access to certain geological documentation related to an Adirondack survey conducted in 1984, and to ensure that the individual in possession of related materials described only as EC would be rendered legally and practically unable to act on or disclose said materials. EC. Everett Caldwell. Renata sat on the floor of her own bedroom closet with 4 photographs on her phone, a contract in her hands, and 12 pages of gambling debt documentation spread across her knees, and she told me later that what she felt in that moment was not primarily anger, though anger was certainly present. What she felt first, before anything else, was a grief so physical it was almost nausea. Because she had loved Preston once. She had built a life with him in good faith. And what the documents on the floor told her was that the man she had married had sold his own father for $4 million and change. She put everything back in the safe exactly as she had found it. She called Cecily Drummond. Then she went to the kitchen, made herself a cup of tea she didn't drink, and sat at the counter waiting for Cecily to call back with a plan. It was while she was sitting there, tea cooling phone face up on the counter, that she noticed Preston's jacket hanging on the kitchen chair. He had worn it to the office Monday morning and left it there the way he always left things, certain someone else would attend to them. She almost didn't check the pocket. But her hands moved before her caution could catch up, and her fingers closed around something small and hard and rectangular. A phone. Not Preston's regular phone, a different device, compact, prepaid, the kind that leaves no account trail. She turned it on. The screen asked for no password. The last sent message was still open, addressed to a number with no contact name attached. 7 words. The old man doesn't know yet. We're still on schedule. The timestamp read September 13th, 2024. 7:42 in the morning. The morning after the gala. The morning Beckett Harlow and I had sat on Fifth Avenue, and he had told me his father's name for the first time, while I had been sitting in my Brooklyn kitchen at my laptop with my cold coffee waiting for Edmund's face to appear on my screen. Preston had been typing those words on a phone designed to disappear. Renata set the burner phone on the kitchen counter. She picked up her real phone. She called Cecily Drummond back. I need to know. She said, her voice steady in the way that certain people go steady when they have passed through the far side of shock, what my legal obligations are if I have evidence of a crime. 7 days is a long time to spend inside your own head. After the courthouse, after Gordon's office, after the power of attorney draft folded into my jacket pocket, I had done what the lawyers told me to do, stayed calm, stayed home, stayed reachable. Gordon had filed the emergency response. The hearing was scheduled. There was a process in motion, and process, Gordon reminded me with the patience of a man who had seen impatience destroy many otherwise winnable cases, required that I trust it, so I stayed home. I read. I called Rita every evening. I spoke with Beckett twice, brief, careful conversations in which we both said less than we meant, because we had both begun to understand that carefulness was a form of protection. Edmund and I exchanged short emails, nothing sensitive, nothing that could be useful to someone reading over our shoulders, just the quiet checking in of 2 old friends, rediscovering the habit of each other's company. I kept the study door closed. Friday night came in the way late September evenings come to Carroll Gardens, a gradual cooling, the smell of someone's dinner drifting from a nearby window. The neighborhood shifting from the purposeful noise of early evening to the looser, quieter register of a place settling in for the night. I had eaten leftover pasta, washed the single plate, and was in the living room with a book I was not actually reading when I heard the back door. Not a knock. Not the bell. The back door, the one that opens from the small yard into the kitchen, the one I had locked that morning, with the deadbolt and the sliding chain, because Rita had called 3 days ago and told me with the firmness of someone who has made a decision on your behalf that I needed to start locking the chain. I heard it, a sound between a click and a give, the particular sound of a door yielding to pressure that should not have been sufficient to move it. I set the book down. The kitchen light was off. The living room lamp behind me put me in silhouette against the doorway, which I understood. In the half-second I had to understand anything was a disadvantage. I reached for my phone on the side table. I don't fully know why instinct, perhaps, or the particular reflex of a man who had spent a week being told that documentation was his best defense and pressed record on the voice memo application just as the shape appeared in the kitchen doorway. He was large. That was the first thing I registered, a broad-shouldered man in dark clothing, face covered by a balaclava moving with the unhurried purpose of someone who believed he had time on his side. He was across the living room in 4 steps and had both hands on my jacket collar before I fully understood that this was actually happening to me in my own house on a Friday night in Carroll Gardens. He slammed me back against the bookcase. The impact rattled the shelves and sent 2 books to the floor and drove the air out of my body in a way that made the room go briefly white at the edges. My phone hit the carpet but stayed recording. I could hear it, a faint red light in my peripheral vision, the screen still active. "Where is it?" the man said. His voice was low and deliberate, with the flatness of someone repeating a question they have been paid to ask. "The map. The old survey. Where is it?" I tried to answer and produced something that was not quite words. He pulled me forward by the collar and slammed me back again, and this time the pain across my shoulders was sharp and specific and real in a way that cut through the shock and made me suddenly and completely furious. "I don't have it," I said, and my voice came out steadier than I had any right to expect. "I have never had it." "Wrong answer," he said. He had raised his free hand when the back door, the same back door he had come through, crashed open with a force that shook the kitchen wall. Frank Doyle came through it like a man 20 years younger than 65, holding a flashlight in one hand, with the blunt practicality of someone who grabbed the nearest heavy object and decided it would serve. Frank, my neighbor for 19 years, a retired transit worker who had once chased off a would-be car thief with a snow shovel, was not a man who performed heroism. He simply did what was in front of him. "Hey!" Frank's voice was enormous in the small room. "Hey, I already called the cops. They are on their way right now, you hear me, right now." The man released my collar. For a fraction of a second, he looked at Frank, then back at me, and then he said something quickly under his breath that I know he did not intend me to hear clearly. "Tell Caldwell to stop digging. This is the last warning." Then he went back through the kitchen, the way he had come, fast and quiet, and the back door swung shut behind him, and the house was suddenly full of the ordinary sounds of a Friday night. A television from the house next door, a car passing on the street, my own breathing, which was ragged and too loud in my ears. Frank crossed the room in 3 steps and grabbed my arm with both hands. His face was pale beneath his usual weathered color, pale and tight with an anger that was, I understood, fear wearing its working clothes. "Everett!" His grip was firm, grounding the grip of a man who needed to confirm that what he was holding was still intact. "Everett, are you? Can you walk? Are you hurt?" "My back," I said. "The bookcase. I can stand." "Don't," he said sharply. "Sit. Sit right there until the police arrive." He pulled out his own phone, checked something, put it back. "I called 911 4 minutes ago when I saw the light in your backyard moving wrong. I've been watching your house, Everett. Rita asked me to." I looked at him, this man who had lived 40 feet from me for nearly 2 decades, and borrowed my ladder twice a year, and brought me soup the week Eleanor died, and my throat tightened in a way that had nothing to do with the man who had just left, and everything to do with the ordinary, uncelebrated loyalty of a good neighbor. "Thank you, Frank," I said. My voice was not steady this time. Detective Lou Mancini arrived 11 minutes later, 48 years old, a Brooklyn native with a compact, watchful manner, and the particular quality of attention that good detectives develop, which is the ability to look at a scene and understand what it is telling them before anyone explains it. He took my statement, examined the back door, photographed the living room. Then he moved to the study doorway and stood there for a long moment looking at the shelf. He pulled on a latex glove. He lifted the lid of the cardboard file box, Eleanor's box, Professional Records, 1980 to 1995, and examined the inside with a small flashlight. "Mr. Caldwell," he said without turning around, "when was the last time someone other than you had their hands inside this box?" "No one has," I said. "It was my wife's. She labeled it. I haven't opened it in 4 years." Mancini looked at the inside of the lid for another 3 seconds. "Then we have a problem," he said, "because someone left a partial thumbprint on the interior lid panel that I am reasonably confident did not come from you." He looked up at me then, and his expression was carefully neutral, in the way of a man who has just found the first thread of something larger. "I'm going to need to get forensics in here tonight." He reached for his radio, and I sat on my own couch in my own house with bruises forming across my shoulders, and a phone still lying on the carpet, with 40 seconds of a man's voice recorded on it, and I understood that whatever process Gordon had told me to trust had just acquired a great deal of new evidence. Before I go further, someone just broke into a 60-year-old man's home and demanded a map that could destroy a billion-dollar empire. Comment ring right now if you are still here with me. I need to know you are with me before I show you what Everett did next. Just a note. Some elements ahead are fictional, shaped for storytelling purposes. If that is not your cup of tea, no hard feelings at all. But if you are staying, let's keep going. The 76th Precinct on Union Street smells like burned coffee and old paperwork, which is to say it smells like every police precinct I have ever had occasion to visit. And by Saturday morning, I had decided that this particular smell was oddly comforting, the scent of a place where things get written down and taken seriously. Mancini had called me at 7:45. Not to summon me, he had been careful about that, careful in the way of a detective who understands that a 60-year-old man with bruised shoulders and a fresh crime scene in his living room deserves to be asked rather than ordered. "If you're up to coming in," he said, "I have things to show you. If you're not, I can come to you." I told him I would come to him, because sitting in my house waiting for information felt worse than any amount of physical discomfort. Gordon Fitch met me at the precinct entrance. I had called him from the car, and the two of us were shown to a small conference room on the second floor, where Mancini had laid out 3 printed documents on the table with the methodical arrangement of a man who thinks spatially. "I'll start with the fingerprint," Mancini said, sitting across from us and folding his hands on the table. "The partial we lifted from the inside of your file box lid. It ran through AFIS. He caught my expression and clarified, "The Automated Fingerprint Identification System, the National Criminal Database. We got a hit this morning. The print belongs to a man named Derek Salter, 41 years old, Queens resident. 2 prior convictions, one for aggravated assault in 2017, one for criminal menacing in 2020. He slid the first document across the table. He's not subtle, and he's not new to this kind of work. I looked at the photograph on the document. A flat, unremarkable face stared back at me, and despite the balaclava he had worn in my living room, I was certain enough that my hands tightened on the edge of the table. His last documented employer, Mancini continued, was a private security and consulting firm called Garrison Risk Solutions, licensed, legitimate-looking on paper based in Midtown. He paused and slid the second document across. Garrison Risk Solutions has one primary corporate client. All of their billed hours for the past 18 months, every single invoice goes to one entity. Gordon leaned forward and read the document before I could. He looked up at Mancini. Redwood Consulting, LLC. Redwood Consulting, LLC, Mancini confirmed. Which as of this morning our Financial Crimes Unit has confirmed is a Delaware-registered subsidiary of Stowe Corporation, I said. Mancini looked at me with the measured expression of a detective who is recalibrating how much a civilian already knows. "You're ahead of me," he said. "I've been doing my own research." I said, which was true in the sense that Beckett and Gordon and Renata had collectively been doing research and sharing the results with me. Gordon set the document down. Lou, this creates a direct line. Stowe Corp funds Redwood Consulting. Redwood Consulting employs Garrison Risk Solutions. Garrison Risk Solutions sends Derek Salter to break into my client's home, assault him, and demand a geological map. He spoke precisely, not dramatically, the way lawyers speak when they want a chain of logic to be absolutely clear. That is a conspiracy to commit assault potentially aggravated with organized criminal elements that bring it into federal RICO territory. Mancini nodded slowly. Which is why I made a call this morning that I want to tell you about, before it becomes more official. He looked at me directly. I reached out to a contact at the FBI field office on Federal Plaza. Given the shell company structure, the interstate elements, the financial complexity, this is moving beyond what my precinct handles most efficiently. The federal angle makes this their jurisdiction. He paused. They're interested. Very interested. Gordon and I exchanged a look. I felt something shift in the room, the weight of the situation reorganizing itself, becoming heavier and more structured, at the same time the way a geological formation clarifies under proper analysis. What about the recording? I asked. Mancini's expression did something I hadn't seen it do before, a brief controlled satisfaction, quickly professional again. Your 40-second recording, he said, captures the phrase, "Tell Caldwell to stop digging, this is the last warning," with sufficient clarity for voice analysis. We're running it against Salter's prior arrest recordings now. Under federal one-party consent law, since you were a participant in the conversation, it is fully admissible. He folded his hands again. Mr. Caldwell, you may have recorded the best piece of evidence in this case by pure instinct. My instinct, I said, was to have something to hold on to. I didn't know what I was doing. Most good evidence gets collected that way, Mancini said. Gordon was making notes on his legal pad when the door to the conference room opened. The uniformed officer who had shown us up put his head in. Detective, there's a woman downstairs asking for you by name. Says she has physical evidence related to the Caldwell case. He glanced at me. Her name is Renata Caldwell. The room went very still. Gordon's pen stopped moving. Mancini looked at me with his careful, assessing eyes. I felt something complicated move through my chest, not surprise exactly, because some part of me had understood since Task 7, since the moment Cecily Drummond's voice had come through the phone, and Renata had sat on her bedroom floor, with gambling debts spread across her knees, that this was coming. But understanding something in principle and experiencing it in a precinct conference room on a Saturday morning are two entirely different things. Send her up, Mancini said. Renata came through the door 3 minutes later. She was dressed simply, jeans, a dark coat, her hair down in a way I had rarely seen, which made her look younger and more exhausted at the same time. She was carrying a small bag over one shoulder. She looked at Mancini first, then at Gordon, and then finally at me. Her eyes were red at the edges. She had been crying recently, I thought, and with considerable effort expended in stopping. I have everything, she said. Her voice was controlled but thin like a wire under tension. She reached into the bag and produced a USB drive, which she set on the table between us. The documents from the safe, photographs of the geological map copy, the gambling debt records, the contract with Redwood Consulting, and photographs of the burner phone, including the sent message from September 13th. She pressed her lips together hard. It's all on there. Cecily Drummond, my attorney, has reviewed everything. She advised me to bring it here directly. Mancini reached for the drive. Gordon was already sitting forward. Renata looked at me. Her hands were clasped in front of her now, very tight, the knuckles slightly pale. Everett, she said. And the use of my first name, she had always called me nothing at all in 3 years of marriage to my son, no name, no title. The particular neutrality of a woman who has decided not to commit landed differently now. Before you look at any of that, there is something I need to tell you about Preston. Something that isn't in any document. Her voice dropped until it was almost private, almost just between the two of us, in a room with other people in it. Something he said to me the night after the gala when he thought I was asleep. She stopped there. And the expression on her face, grief and determination in equal measure, the face of a woman who has made an irreversible decision and is living in the first moments of its consequences, told me that whatever she was about to say had the particular weight of something that could not be unsaid. I waited. She told me what Preston had said, the way you tell someone something you have been rehearsing carefully, with pauses in the right places, as though the words needed to be handled precisely, or they might mean something other than what she intended. The night after the gala, she said she had been lying in the dark of their bedroom, turned toward the window, her back to Preston. She wasn't asleep. She hadn't been anywhere near sleep. She had been thinking about the ring, about the young man who had grabbed Everett's wrist, about the name Edmund Harlow hanging in the ballroom air. Preston had come to bed late, and for a while there was just the sound of him settling shoes, dropped the specific sounds of a man moving through his own bedroom in the dark. Then he had spoken. Not to her, she was certain of that. To himself or to the ceiling in the low half voice of a man who believes he is alone with his thoughts. The old man has something, Preston had said. Something that could destroy everything. And if he figures out what it is, if Harlow's kid has already told him we're finished. Renata had not moved. Had not altered her breathing. Had lain completely still and listened to her husband talk to the dark of their bedroom about his father, as though his father were a problem to be managed, rather than a person to be considered. I listened to her tell me this, and felt something move through me that was not anger I had already had burned through in the first hours after the guardianship papers arrived. What I felt listening to Renata was something quieter and more permanent. Something like the final closing of a door I had been trying to hold open for 35 years. "There's more," Renata said. Her hands were still clasped, still tight. I went back through our timeline after I found the contract in the safe. Preston and I met at an Apex Capital event in March 2021. He pursued me very deliberately, very specifically. Within 3 months, we were living together. Within 8 months, we were engaged. She stopped, drew a breath that was slightly unsteady at its edges. The contract with Redwood Consulting is dated March 14, 2024. But there is a preliminary memorandum of understanding attached to it, a document that sets out the initial terms of the arrangement dated September 2020. She looked at me with eyes that were dry now, painfully dry, the look of someone who has cried everything out and arrived at something beyond tears. 6 months before he met me. He had already agreed in principle to this arrangement 6 months before he met me. The room was very quiet around us. Mancini was writing. Gordon had stopped writing entirely and was looking at the table. I thought about Preston at 8 years old, sitting at the kitchen table doing homework, while Eleanor helped him with long division patient, and warm her hand covering his on the pencil. I thought about teaching him to ride a bicycle in Prospect Park on a Sunday morning in 1995, the particular terrified joy on his face when he understood that I had let go and he was riding alone. I thought about all the ordinary mornings of a father's life with a son, and I tried to locate the place where the man I had known had become the man who would spend 4 years building a life with a woman he had chosen as a strategic convenience. I could not find it. The geography simply didn't hold together. "Renata," I said. My voice came out rougher than I intended. "I want you to know something. Whatever Preston did, whatever this was, you are not responsible for it. You did not cause it. And the fact that you are sitting in this room right now with that USB drive on that table tells me something about the kind of person you actually are that has nothing to do with him." Her jaw tightened. Her chin lifted slightly. "I loved him," she said, and the past tense of it landed in the room with a weight that required no elaboration. "I would like that to be noted somewhere. I loved him, and I am here anyway." "It's noted," Mancini said quietly from across the table. He was looking at her with something that was not quite sympathy and not quite professional respect, and was perhaps the precise combination of the two. "Mrs. Caldwell, what you've brought in today, the USB contents, your testimony about what you overheard, constitutes substantial evidence of criminal conspiracy fraud upon the court and potentially violations of federal RICO statutes. I need to ask, are you prepared to give a formal recorded statement to federal investigators?" Renata straightened in her chair. "That's why I'm here," she said. By 2 o'clock that afternoon, we were at 26 Federal Plaza in Lower Manhattan, a building that manages to be both imposing and utterly anonymous at the same time, which seems appropriate for the headquarters of an agency that prefers its authority to be felt rather than advertised. FBI Special Agent Sandra Merritt met us in a conference room on the 14th floor. She was 45 years old, with the compact efficiency of someone who wastes nothing, not words, not movement, not attention. She had reviewed Mancini's preliminary report on the drive from Brooklyn and had a legal pad covered in organized questions before Renata had finished sitting down. The formal interview lasted 3 hours. I sat outside in a waiting area with Gordon drinking bad coffee from a paper cup and watching people move through the corridors with the purposeful quiet of an institution that runs on information. Gordon worked on his laptop. I stared at the wall and thought about Eleanor's letter still unopened on my desk at home. At 5:15, Agent Merritt came out of the interview room and asked Gordon and me to come back in. Renata was still at the table, pale and composed in the way of someone who has just completed something that required everything they had. "We've issued an emergency court order to freeze the financial accounts associated with Redwood Consulting, LLC, and its parent structures," Agent Merritt said without preamble. She sat down across from us and opened a folder. "That includes accounts directly connected to Preston Caldwell, which we identified through the documentation Mrs. Caldwell provided." She paused. "In conducting that financial review, we found something that wasn't in any of the documents on the USB drive." Gordon leaned forward. "What did you find?" "A third party," Merritt said. Her voice was level and precise. "Someone has been making regular payments into an offshore account connected to Redwood Consulting for the past 2 years. The payments are structured to avoid automatic reporting thresholds, just under $10,000 each time, which under the Bank Secrecy Act is a federal offense in itself called structuring." She looked at me directly. "The payments do not originate from Preston Caldwell. They do not originate from any Stowe Corp entity we have identified so far." She closed the folder. "We are still working to identify the source. But Mr. Caldwell, whoever this third party is, they have been funding this operation longer than Preston has been formally involved." I felt the floor of the situation shift beneath me, the familiar geological sensation of realizing that what you thought was bedrock is in fact a surface layer, and that there is something else entirely underneath. "Who?" I asked. Agent Merritt shook her head. "Not yet, but we will find out." She held my gaze for a moment. "What I can tell you is that this case is now significantly larger than a guardianship fraud and an assault. What this looks like from where I'm sitting today is a coordinated long-term operation, and someone outside the people you already know about has had a hand in it from the beginning. 60 Center Street is one of those buildings that was designed to make you feel the weight of the institution before you have said a single word inside it. I have driven past the Manhattan courthouse hundreds of times in my life, Without once going in the way New Yorkers accumulate landmarks they never enter. Walking through its doors on the morning of October 10th felt like stepping into a different register of reality marble floors that carried every footstep back to you as an echo, ceilings high enough to make a full-grown man feel approximate the particular hush of a place where words carry legal consequence and people choose them accordingly. Gordon met me in the lobby at 8:30, carrying his briefcase and 2 coffees, which I took as evidence that he was a man who understood that good preparation and small kindnesses were not mutually exclusive. He handed me one without comment, and we rode the elevator to the 4th floor together. "How are you feeling?" he asked. "Like a man who is about to sit in a room with his son and watch a judge explain to both of them how low things have gotten," I said. Gordon considered this. "That is an accurate description of what is about to happen," he said. "Try to remember that accurate descriptions are not the same as defeat." The courtroom was smaller than I had imagined, wood-paneled, with long benches arranged in careful rows, and a raised bench at the front, where Judge Patricia Howe would preside. Renata was already there when we arrived, seated 3 rows back on the left side, her coat folded on her lap. Her expression carrying the particular composure of someone who has made peace with a difficult decision and is now simply seeing it through. She gave me a small nod when I entered. I returned it. Preston arrived 7 minutes before the hearing was scheduled to begin. He came in through a side door with his attorney, a man I did not know expensively suited, and took his seat at the petitioner's table without looking in my direction. He looked, I noticed, like a man who had not been sleeping well. His jaw was set, and his shoulders were carrying tension that his suit could not entirely conceal. He was 35 years old, and he looked in that morning's light like a younger version of himself wearing an older man's worries. I sat at the respondent's table beside Gordon and looked at the back of my son's head and felt something I had not anticipated feeling. Not anger, not satisfaction at the reversal of circumstances, but a grief that was clean and final, like the last page of a book you have been reading for a very long time. Judge Patricia Howe entered at 9 o'clock exactly. 62 years old, with close-cropped silver hair and the upright posture of someone who had sat on a bench for 20 years and never once allowed the chair to shape her. She settled her papers, adjusted her glasses, and looked at the room in a way that suggested she had assessed it completely before anyone else had finished standing. "Be seated," she said. Her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. The hearing proceeded with the formal rhythm of legal procedure. Appearances entered documents, submitted the technical language of Article 81 of the New York Mental Hygiene Law laid out in its precise terminology. Article 81, Gordon had explained to me, governs the appointment of guardians for adults alleged to be incapacitated. It exists to protect vulnerable people. What Preston had attempted was to weaponize that protection, to turn a law designed for the elderly and infirm into an instrument of control over a man who was neither. Gordon presented the medical license registry evidence first. He placed the New York State Office of the Profession's search results on the court's display screen, the search for Gerald Whitson, the empty results field, and let it sit there for a moment before he spoke. "Your Honor," he said, "the medical evaluation supporting this petition was authored by an individual with no valid medical license in the state of New York, operating under a facility name that has no registration with any state or county authority. The document is in its entirety a fabrication." Preston's attorney objected on procedural grounds. Judge Howe overruled him with the particular brevity of a judge who has heard the same objection in too many variations to find it interesting anymore. Gordon then presented the phone records. 17 calls placed from Preston Caldwell's registered mobile number to the answering service associated with the Whitson Neurological Institute address, spread across 6 weeks between July 15th and August 28th, the day the fake evaluation was dated. Each call was logged with date, time, and duration. The pattern was unmistakable, not the single call of a man who had found a convenient doctor, but the sustained contact of a man who had been building a fictional medical history for his father over the course of 6 weeks. The courtroom was very quiet while Gordon presented this. The kind of quiet that happens when a room full of people is processing something that is worse than what they expected. Preston's attorney requested a recess to confer with his client. Judge Howe denied it. "The evidence before this court," she said when Gordon had concluded, "does not present a close legal question. It presents a clear one. This petition is not supported by legitimate medical documentation. It is supported by documentation that appears to have been deliberately fabricated for the purpose of this proceeding." She removed her glasses and looked at Preston with an expression that was not hostile. It was something more considered than hostility, something that had taken its time arriving and was therefore more permanent. "The petition is denied in its entirety." She replaced her glasses. "Furthermore, this court is referring the matter of the fraudulent medical documentation to the Manhattan District Attorney's Office for investigation of fraud upon the court and related criminal offenses." She paused. "The petitioner is ordered to surrender his passport to this court by 5 o'clock this afternoon, pending the outcome of that investigation, as a condition of continued residence in this jurisdiction." Preston's attorney was on his feet with an objection before she finished the sentence. Judge Howe looked at him with the patience of a woman who has been looked at that way by attorneys for 2 decades. "Counselor," she said quietly, "I suggest you spend the next several hours advising your client on the appropriate response to a criminal referral rather than objecting to measures designed to ensure his availability for that process." The attorney sat down. The hearing was concluded in 40 minutes total. Gordon gathered his papers with the unhurried efficiency of a man who had expected this outcome and found the confirmation satisfying. I sat at the respondent's table and let the room empty around me, and tried to feel something uncomplicated, relief, perhaps, or vindication. What I felt instead was the complicated residue of a morning spent watching a son's legal strategy disassembled in public piece by piece in front of a judge who had found every piece wanting. I was gathering my own coat when I became aware that Preston had not yet left. He was standing near the side door, his attorney beside him, and he was looking at me. Not the calculating look from the gala, not the performance of a son adjusting his father's lapel. Something else, an expression I had not seen on his face since he was perhaps 12 years old. Something uncertain and unresolved, and almost in its way frightened. Then his attorney leaned in and spoke quietly into his ear. Whatever the words were, they arrived with precision. I watched the color leave Preston's face in a way that was almost immediate, as though someone had opened a valve. His jaw tightened. His hand gripped the doorframe. He turned and walked out without looking at me again. I stood in the emptying courtroom and understood that whatever his attorney had just told him was not about today's ruling. Today's ruling he had prepared for on some level. What his attorney had told him was something new, something he had not seen coming. I had imagined this moment many times over 40 years, in the way you imagine things you believe will never actually happen loosely, without committing to the details. Because committing to the details of something impossible feels like a particular kind of cruelty to yourself. The arrivals hall at JFK Terminal 4 on a Monday morning is not by any objective measure a romantic setting. It is fluorescent lit and crowded, and smells of recycled air and coffee from a franchise cart near the exit doors. Families hold handwritten signs. Children run at angles that suggest no awareness of other people's knees. The general noise is a composite of rolling luggage and announcement systems and the particular acoustic chaos of a space designed for function rather than feeling. None of that mattered. Edmund came through the arrivals door at 9:47, and I knew him before I had consciously processed that I was seeing him the way you know a piece of music from its first 3 notes. He was 60 years old, and he walked with a slight forward lean that was new, the posture of a man who had spent decades at a drafting table, and his white hair was cut close and neat, and he was carrying a canvas shoulder bag on one side and a rectangular wooden box under his other arm held against his body, with the careful deliberateness of someone transporting something irreplaceable. He saw me and stopped walking entirely. For one full second, we simply looked at each other across 20 feet of arrivals hall, two men in their 60s, one of whom had spent 40 years thinking the other was dead. Then Edmund pressed his free hand over his eyes, a brief private gesture, the gesture of a man who had prepared himself for this moment and found that preparation was not the same as readiness, and crossed the distance between us. We embraced the way men of our generation and profession embrace firmly, with both arms, without ceremony, the way you hold on to something you had resigned yourself to losing. I felt his hand press flat against my back. I felt his shoulders shake once and then go still with the effort of steadying. "You are exactly as stubborn-looking as I remembered," Edmund said into my shoulder. His voice was thick and unsteady and wholly genuine. "You are considerably older," I said into his. "I want you to know I find that deeply unfair." He laughed, a real laugh this time. Not the fractured sound from the video call, but the full laugh of a man who has arrived somewhere he thought he would never reach, and discovered that the relief of it is almost unbearable. Beckett was standing 6 feet behind me. I stepped back and turned and watched the moment when Edmund Harlow saw his son standing in an airport arrivals hall for only the second time in either of their lives, the first having been 8 months ago in Edinburgh when Beckett had traveled to find him. Edmund's face did something I cannot fully describe. It was not a single emotion, but a sequence of them moving so quickly they almost overlapped recognition, love, guilt, gratitude, and something that was perhaps relief at a scale that requires no name because it is too large to need one. Beckett crossed to his father and put his arms around him, and Edmund held on with both arms, and the wooden box pressed awkwardly between them, and neither of them said anything for a long moment, because some things are not improved by words. I looked away at the franchise coffee cart near the exit, and blinked several times more than strictly necessary. We took a cab to the Upper West Side to Café Lalo on West 83rd Street. Edmund kept the wooden box on his lap the entire ride the same way he had carried it across the Atlantic. And I did not suggest he put it anywhere else, Edmund's choice made, because Beckett had described it to him in an email 3 months ago, and he had filed it away with the particular intention of a man who was planning to be somewhere he was not yet certain he would reach. The cafe was warm and unhurried, with round marble tables and mismatched chairs, and the comfortable, accumulated character of a place that has been itself for a long time without needing to change. Edmund set the wooden box on the table between us and ordered coffee with the focused pleasure of a man who has been in transit for 8 hours and earned the right to take his time. The box was plain dark wood, latched with a small brass fitting with Edmund's initials carved into the top corner. In a hand I recognized as his own, the same precise architectural lettering he had used to annotate field notes in 1984. "I carried it onto the plane," he said when he saw me looking at it. "Not in checked luggage, on my lap essentially for the entire flight." He paused. "I am aware that is not the most dignified image." "It is an extremely dignified image," I said. "Open it." He unlatched the brass fitting and lifted the lid. Inside, protected by a layer of acid-free archival paper, the kind used for preserving architectural drawings, was a rolled document approximately 2 feet wide when fully extended. Edmund lifted it out with both hands and unrolled it carefully on the table, weighting the corners with our coffee cups. The 1984 Adirondack Geological Survey Map. Original. Hand-drafted on linen-backed paper, the kind used for technical documents before digital drafting made it obsolete. Grid references in precise ink, elevation markings, section notations, and in the lower right corner of Section 7, the eastern shaft designation, surrounded by a dense cluster of mineral classification symbols and a handwritten notation in Edmund's drafting hand. Significant REE concentration confirmed. Requires full federal survey assessment. EH/EC October 14th, 1984. October 14th. 40 years to the day. Neither of us mentioned it. We didn't need to. Beckett was examining the map with the focused attention of an engineer looking at something he has heard described but never seen. He pointed to the notation. REE, he said. Rare earth elements, Edmund said. The classification we used in 1984. What sits beneath that section of the Adirondack Survey area is, by current geological and market assessments, one of the most significant undeveloped rare earth deposits in the northeastern United States. He looked at me. Worth approximately $2.4 billion at current extraction values. Stowe Corp knew. That notation, our signatures that date, is the document that proves they knew. The cafe moved around us in its ordinary way. A server refilled Edmund's coffee without being asked. Conrad Ellery arrived at noon. I had not met him before, though Gordon had mentioned his name. Conrad Ellery, 44 years old, investigative journalist at the New York Tribune, a lean, watchful man with a reporter's quality of attention that made you feel slightly uncomfortably that whatever you said was being filed away with precision. He had contacted Beckett 3 weeks prior through channels I didn't fully understand, and Beckett had decided after consulting Gordon and Agent Merritt that the conversation was worth having. He sat down, declined coffee, and placed a thin folder on the table. I've been investigating Stowe Corp for 8 months, he said without preamble, the manner of a man who respects other people's time enough to skip the foreword. Specifically, the 1984 Adirondack incident and what followed. I have corroborating evidence from a former Stowe Corp employee, someone with direct access to internal documentation, that confirms 2 things independently of anything you have. He opened the folder and slid 3 pages across. 1, the explosion was deliberately ordered and executed under Reginald Stowe's personal authorization. 2, Stowe Corp has maintained an active internal program for the past 4 decades, specifically designed to suppress, acquire, or destroy any surviving documentation from the 1984 survey. Edmund picked up the pages. His hands were steady, but there was a tightness around his eyes that told me steadiness was costing him something. Your source, Gordon said carefully from beside me. Can you characterize their credibility without identifying them? Conrad looked at Gordon with the patient expression of a journalist who has had this conversation before. My source had direct professional access to Stowe Corp's internal compliance records for 11 years, he said. They retained personal copies of relevant documentation as a matter of professional self-protection. Their motivation for coming forward now is personal, not financial. He paused. And their credibility is frankly beyond question, because Reginald Stowe is their father. The table went very still. Beckett set down his coffee cup. Edmund lowered the pages slowly. I looked at Conrad, and Conrad looked back at me with the expression of a man delivering information he understands is a grenade and has chosen to hand over carefully. His daughter, I said. His daughter, Conrad confirmed, and she is prepared to testify. Before I reveal what the FBI found inside Stowe Corporation's private archive, something that had been locked away for 40 years with Everett's name on it, comment truth right now. Because what comes next will change everything you thought you understood about this story. Note some elements of what follows are fictional, built for storytelling and educational purposes. If this is not content you wish to continue with, you may step away here. But I truly hope you stay. The Tribune ran the story on the front page of the Monday morning edition above the fold. I know this because Beckett sent me a photograph of the physical newspaper at 6:47 in the morning. He had apparently gone out specifically to buy a copy, which struck me as exactly the kind of thing Beckett Harlow would do. The headline read, Stowe Corporation and the Adirondack Cover-Up 40 Years of Silence on a $2.4 billion Secret. Conrad Ellery's byline was beneath it, and the article ran to 4 full pages inside with reproductions of 3 key documents. None of them the original map, which remained in Gordon's custody as formal evidence, but corroborating records that Conrad had obtained through his own investigation. I sat at my kitchen table in Carroll Gardens and read every word of it twice. Conrad had done what good investigative journalism does at its best. He had taken a story that was complex and technical and layered with 40 years of deliberate obfuscation and rendered it in language that any reader could follow without losing a single essential fact. He described the 1984 survey. He described the explosion. He described Stowe Corp's documented financial interest in suppressing the geological findings. He named Reginald Stowe directly with the particular precision of a journalist who has checked his sourcing enough times to be absolutely certain. He did not name his source. By 8 o'clock in the morning, the Tribune's website had registered over 400,000 unique visitors to the article. By 9, 3 other major outlets had picked up the story. By 9:30, Stowe Corp's publicly traded holdings had dropped 11% on the opening of the New York Stock Exchange. I watched all of this from my kitchen table, with Edmund sitting across from me. He was staying in my guest room for the duration, an arrangement that felt both practical and profoundly right, like restoring a piece of furniture to the room it had always belonged in, and Beckett calling every 30 minutes with updates that arrived faster than either of us could fully process. "This is going to move quickly now," Edmund said, watching the news feed on his laptop. His voice was measured, but his hands were wrapped around his coffee mug with more force than the temperature required. "Once it's public, the pressure changes. People who were comfortable staying quiet recalculate." He was right. He was right in ways that neither of us fully anticipated. Nora Stowe walked into the FBI field office at 26 Federal Plaza at 10:15 that same morning, accompanied by her personal attorney and carrying a briefcase that contained, as Agent Merritt described it to me later, 11 years of professional conscience made physical. I am reconstructing what happened in that building from what Agent Merritt told me in a phone call that evening, and from a written summary Gordon obtained through proper legal channels 3 weeks later. I was not there. But I have thought about it enough times that it feels in its essentials as real to me as the things I witnessed directly. Nora Stowe was 45 years old, with her father's precision, and it became clear none of his willingness to use that precision in the service of deliberate harm. She had worked for 11 years in Stowe Corp's compliance division, the department responsible for ensuring the company adhered to legal and regulatory requirements before resigning 4 years ago, over what she described in her testimony as a pattern of instructed non-compliance that I was no longer able to participate in or remain silent about. She had not gone to the authorities when she left. She told Agent Merritt in the careful, honest language of someone who has asked themselves the same question many times that she had not gone because she did not yet have enough, because the documents she had retained were significant, but not conclusive, and because she understood with the cold clarity of someone who has grown up inside a powerful family that an incomplete case against Reginald Stowe would not merely fail. It would be destroyed, and she along with it. Conrad Ellery's article had changed the calculation. The story was public now. The original map was in legal custody. The FBI investigation was formally open. The moment Nora had been waiting for, the moment when coming forward meant contributing to something that could actually succeed rather than being isolated and crushed, had arrived. She opened the briefcase on Agent Merritt's conference table and produced a series of documents in archival plastic sleeves, each one labeled in her own handwriting, with date source and a brief description of contents. 11 years of careful, systematic documentation, maintained with the professional precision of someone who had always known this day might come and had prepared for it accordingly. The centerpiece was a single-page internal memorandum, dated October 8th, 1984, 6 days before the mine explosion. It was addressed to the site operations director of the Adirondack Project and authorized in language that was deliberately indirect but unmistakably clear in its intent. The permanent termination of survey activity in Section 7 of the Eastern Shaft, effective October 14th. It cited safety concerns as the official justification. In the margin, in a different hand from the main text, someone had written a single word, confirmed. The memorandum carried 2 signatures. The first was Reginald Stowe. The second signature was partially obscured, either by age or by deliberate damage to that corner of the document, but the first 3 letters of the surname were legible. Nora had examined the document many times over 11 years and had never been able to confirm the second name with certainty. She told Agent Merritt she had always assumed it was an internal Stowe Corp executive. What she did not know, what none of us knew yet, was whether that assumption was correct. The second signature, Agent Merritt told me when she called that evening. Her voice had the controlled energy of someone working a case that had just expanded significantly. We've sent the document to the FBI Forensic Document Analysis Unit in Quantico. They can reconstruct partially obscured text in about 70% of cases using infrared imaging. We'll know within 2 weeks. The FBI raid on Stowe Corp's Midtown headquarters took place at 2 o'clock that afternoon, executed under a federal search warrant that had been applied for and granted with a speed that spoke to how thoroughly Agent Merritt's team had built their case over the preceding weeks. I watched the news coverage from my living room with Edmund. Beside me, footage of federal agents carrying boxes from the building's lobby, Stowe Corp's communications director reading a prepared statement at the entrance, the particular public theater of a powerful institution being formally investigated. Edmund watched it with his hands flat on his knees and his jaw set, and his eyes carrying something I had not seen in them yet, not satisfaction, not relief, but something closer to the feeling of a long-held breath, finally, at enormous cost, released. The phone rang at 7 that evening. Agent Merritt. "Mr. Caldwell," she said, "I need to tell you what we found in Stowe Corp's secure archive this afternoon." I sat down. "There was a physical file maintained in their records system," she continued. "A folder. It contained surveillance photographs, address records, professional history documentation, and periodic status updates." She paused. "The folder had a name on it, Mr. Caldwell. Your name. It has been maintained and updated continuously for 40 years. I pressed my free hand flat against the kitchen table and felt the wood solid and real beneath my palm. "The most recent item in the folder," Agent Merritt said, "is a photograph. It was taken outside your Carroll Gardens home. The timestamp on the print is August 22nd, 2024. She let that land before she continued. 3 weeks before the charity gala. 3 weeks before any of this became visible. Her voice was careful and direct, the voice of a woman who delivers difficult information clearly because clarity is a form of respect. "Mr. Caldwell, someone has been watching you for 40 years, and they were watching you long before your son made his move. Outside my kitchen window, Carroll Gardens was doing what it always did in the October evening. The lights coming on in the row houses, the smell of someone's dinner. The ordinary, comfortable rhythms of a neighborhood that did not know it was the backdrop of something that had been in motion since before most of its current residents were born." I held the phone and looked at Eleanor's rose bushes in the darkening yard, and understood that the ground beneath this story went deeper than any of us had yet measured. He came on a Friday afternoon without calling. 3 firm knocks at the front door, the knock of someone who has made a decision and is moving through it before it can unmake itself. Edmund was in the kitchen making tea. I was in the study when the knock came, and I knew before I stood up. something in the rhythm of it. 35 years of knowing one particular person's way of announcing himself. I opened the door. Preston stood on my front steps in a charcoal suit that looked slept in. His tie loosened his hair, carrying the disorder of a man who had been running his hands through it for several days. His eyes were red at the rims, not from recent crying, but from sustained sleeplessness and the particular dread of a man watching his options disappear one by one. "Can I come in?" he asked. I considered the question with genuine seriousness. This man had filed fraudulent guardianship papers against me. He had arranged for someone to break into my home and assault me. He had traded my safety to Reginald Stowe for the forgiveness of a gambling debt, building a plan around me, the way you build a wall around something you intend to bury. "Yes," I said and stepped back. "Some things you do not, because they are strategically wise, but because they are humanly necessary." He stopped when he saw Edmund in the kitchen doorway. Something crossed his face recognition, though they had never met. He had seen the newspaper coverage. He knew exactly who Edmund Harlow was in the architecture of this story. I brought Preston into the living room. He sat on the edge of the sofa, elbows on his knees, the posture of a man who has not allowed himself to be comfortable in days. I sat across from him in Eleanor's chair. "They froze everything," he said, not as an opening to negotiation, as a statement of fact delivered to the floor between us. "Every account, personal, professional, joint. My Apex Capital access was suspended this morning." He pressed his lips together hard. "I am looking at a great deal, Dad." The word landed differently than it had in years. Raw. Unperformed. Without the flatness or the calculation that had turned a word of closeness into a word of management. "What did you come to say, Preston?" I asked. He looked up at me, really looked the way he had not looked at me in longer than I could accurately measure. "I didn't know about the surveillance file," he said. "The 40 years of photographs. Stowe told me you were a loose end from an old business matter. He told me the guardianship was just a precaution." His voice tightened. "He did not tell me this went back to 1984. I believed him. It changed very little, but I believed him." "The second signature on the 1984 authorization memo," I said carefully, watching his face. "Do you know who it belongs to?" The reaction was immediate, and involuntary eyes, slightly wider hands gripping his own fingers. He stood up and walked to the window with his back to me, shoulders rising and falling, with one long, effortful breath. "Harlan Briggs," he said quietly. "Stowe's legal counsel in 1984. He has been managing the suppression operation independently for 15 years. The offshore payments, the surveillance updates, the directive to search your house before the gala that was Briggs. Not Stowe." Before I could respond, the front door opened. Rita came in already talking, then stopped dead in the living room doorway. She looked at Preston with an expression that moved through grief and fury, and settled into the particular sorrow of a woman who has watched her family damage itself and could not stop it. "Preston," she said, one word carrying everything. "Aunt Rita," he said quietly. And then, to my considerable astonishment, his eyes filled. He did not cry. We Caldwell men do not make a public event of our tears. But his chin trembled once with great effort contained, and I saw in that trembling the boy who had ridden a bicycle in Prospect Park on a Sunday morning and been terrified and brave in equal measure. 4 measured knocks at the front door, official in their rhythm. 2 FBI agents stood on my steps, credentials raised. Preston had heard. He was standing very still in the center of my living room. Suit, slightly wrinkled eyes, steady now with the stillness of a man who has reached the end of a road he chose. He turned and put his wrists together behind his back without being asked. Then he looked at me over the agent's shoulder across the living room that had been Eleanor's, that had been his childhood in every brick and floorboard, and said 4 words in a voice that was entirely, completely his own. "I'm sorry, Dad, truly." I watched my son walk out of my front door and stood in the hallway, pressing one hand flat against the wall to keep myself upright, not looking away until the sedan had pulled out of sight. Rita came and stood beside me. She put her hand over mine on the wall. Behind us in the kitchen, the kettle began to whistle. Nearly 3 months had passed since Preston walked out of my front door between 2 federal agents. 3 months of Gordon's daily calls. 3 months of Edmund across my kitchen table each morning, coffee in hand, the easy rhythm of 2 people rediscovering each other's company. 3 months of not speaking to Preston, his attorney communicating through Gordon that he was cooperating fully with federal investigators, which I took to mean he had chosen the only navigable path remaining to him. I chose to believe it was also, in some small part, because of 4 words spoken in a Carroll Gardens living room on a Friday afternoon in October. The U.S. District Court for the Southern District of New York at 500 Pearl Street carries a different authority from the state courthouse on Center Street. Where the state courthouse has civic tradition, marble echo accumulated dignity, the federal courthouse has something more austere. The architecture of federal power, which operates at a different scale entirely. Gordon met me in the lobby at 8 o'clock with 2 coffees and the focused expression of a man who has spent 3 months building a case into something too dense to be moved. Reginald Stowe was already seated at the defendant's table when we entered, 70 years old. Suit impeccable, still projecting through sheer personal will the impression of a man who has not yet decided whether to take these proceedings seriously. Preston sat at the adjacent table, separated by a formal legal severance that meant each defendant could present evidence working against the other. He had lost weight. He did not look toward the gallery. Harlan Briggs occupied the 3rd defendant's position, 78 years old, thin, upright, carrying the professional courtroom stillness of a man who has spent a lifetime in legal proceedings. He had been taken into federal custody in early December, 2 months after Preston's arrest, when the offshore payment trail and Nora's internal documents gave Agent Merritt sufficient grounds for a warrant. He had co-signed the 1984 authorization that brought a mountain down on 2 young engineers. For 40 years afterward, while I lived an ordinary life in Carroll Gardens, he had maintained a surveillance file with my name on it and sent structured payments through shell companies to keep the machinery of concealment operational. I looked at him across the courtroom and felt nothing dramatic, just cold, complete recognition. The first significant moment came at 10:45, when the prosecution moved to admit Renata's audio recording, 37 seconds, captured on her phone the night after the gala, Preston's voice saying clearly, "The old man has something that could destroy everything. And if he figures out what it is, we're finished." Preston's attorney objected on privacy grounds. The prosecution cited federal one-party consent law. Renata had been a participant in the household space and had full legal authority to make the recording. Judge Howe admitted it without hesitation. Preston's voice filled the courtroom with flat, unglamorous clarity. At the defendant's table, Stowe leaned toward his attorney. Whatever he said, his attorney's response was a single small shake of the head. The second significant moment came after the lunch recess. The prosecution presented the Quantico forensic document analysis of the 1984 authorization memo. Infrared multispectral imaging had reconstructed the partially obscured second signature with 94% confidence. The signature read, Harlan J. Briggs. Briggs's attorney moved immediately to exclude the document, arguing forensic reconstruction constituted material alteration of original evidence. Judge Howe heard the argument, fully, asked 2 questions, and denied the motion. "The document has not been altered," she said. "It has been read. Those are not the same thing." Briggs adjusted slightly in his chair. A small movement. But I saw it. The first day concluded at 4:30. As Gordon and I gathered our materials, Agent Merritt appeared at the gallery rail with a folder and a controlled expression. "Stowe's legal team filed a motion this afternoon," she said quietly. "They are arguing you had prior knowledge of the mineral deposit that you and Edmund jointly withheld the geological findings in 1984 to claim them later. They are naming you as a potential co-conspirator. The familiar tightening moved through my chest. Gordon set his briefcase on the bench and opened it. He produced a single document in a clear evidence sleeve and held it up carefully. Edmund filed a formal disclosure with the U.S. Geological Survey Board in November 1984, he said. From Edinburgh 6 weeks after the explosion. It disclosed the mineral findings and alleged deliberate sabotage through proper federal channels. He looked at me steadily. You withheld nothing, Everett. The disclosure was made. Someone made sure no one ever found it. I stared at the document and felt the ground not destabilize but settle. The way a formation settles when the final piece of evidence confirms what the geology was always telling you. Where did you find it? I asked. Gordon allowed himself a small, precise smile. That, he said, is a story for tomorrow. Gordon told me about the USGS filing over breakfast the morning after the first day of proceedings at a diner 2 blocks from the federal courthouse on Chambers Street. The U.S. Geological Survey maintains physical regulatory archives going back to the 19th century rooms of boxed documents organized by region, year, and submission type. Edmund's 1984 disclosure had been filed correctly received by the regional Albany office and assigned a proper case reference number. What had prevented it from ever being acted upon was a single internal memorandum filed 2 weeks after Edmund's disclosure arrived, directing the case to be reclassified as administratively inactive and transferred to a deep archive designation that removed it from any standard search protocol. The memorandum did not carry USGS letterhead. It carried the letterhead of an outside legal counsel retained for regulatory consultation, Harlan Briggs, 1984. He reached inside the federal regulatory system and buried the one document that could have ended this 40 years ago, Gordon said, cutting his eggs with methodical precision. That is obstruction of federal proceedings, a significantly more serious charge than anything previously filed against him. He looked up at me steadily. Everything Briggs claimed about his role being limited to legal counsel ended the moment we found that memorandum. I drank my coffee and thought about Edmund in Edinburgh filing a disclosure with a system he still believed in, and the system responding with a memorandum designed to erase his voice before anyone official heard it. Cold anger, I had learned, is the most useful kind. The sentencing hearing was different in texture from the trial. The argument had been made. What remained was consequence the formal assignment of accountability by a judge who had spent 2 months examining 40 years of deliberate harm. Edmund was in the gallery when I arrived, sitting beside Beckett, with the careful gratitude of people still learning to occupy the same space. Rita was beside me. She had taken my arm in the lobby without asking the Caldwell method of support, not offering, but simply doing the way she had done things since we were children in Flatbush. Preston was brought in first. He had lost weight. His suit fit differently. He sat with his hands flat on the table and did not look toward the gallery. His attorney had advised composure, and he was following that advice with the focused effort of a man determined to preserve whatever dignity remained available to him. Stowe entered next. The projection of authority that had been so evident in January had diminished, not collapsed, but reduced the way a strong signal weakens over great distance. 70 years old, facing federal custody, and the weight of that prospect had finally begun registering in the set of his shoulders. Briggs came last, moving slowly with a cane. The careful courtroom stillness remained, but it had changed quality, less composure now, and more the stillness of a man who has run out of moves and decided that stillness is at least a remaining form of control. Before sentences were delivered, the prosecution presented one final piece of evidence reserved for this proceeding. 3 days after Preston's October arrest, he had called me from his attorney's office phone. I had let it go to voicemail initially, then called back when Gordon confirmed it was Preston. Within the first 30 seconds, the tone of Preston's voice told me I should not face this call unarmed. I pressed record on my voice memo application. Preston had said many things in 4 minutes and 11 seconds. But near the end, with the desperation of a man reaching for his last remaining options, he had said this: "Dad, if you testify, if you stand up in that courtroom and give them everything, I will make sure Edmund Harlow's name is in every publication in this country. I will make sure that what he did, running, hiding, leaving you to grieve him for 40 years, is the story. Not Stowe, not Briggs. Edmund. Do you understand me?" The recording played through the courtroom speakers in full, unedited detail, a voice speaking, without any awareness. It was being preserved, the sound of a man believing he was alone with his threat. When it ended, the room held a particular quality of quiet, not empty, but full, the way a space feels when everyone in it is processing something simultaneously. Under 18. USC Section 1512. Witness intimidation is a federal felony. The recording was fully admissible under federal one-party consent law. I had been a participant in the call, and federal standards supersede New York's stricter state wiretapping laws in federal proceedings. Gordon had explained this to me carefully twice on 2 separate occasions, because I had needed to be completely certain. The sentences arrived without theater. Judge Howe delivered them in the manner I had come to recognize as entirely hers, measured grave without visible satisfaction, the voice of someone who understands that sentencing is a beginning of a different kind rather than a conclusion. Reginald Stowe, 18 years federal custody forfeiture of $340 million in assets connected to the fraudulent suppression operation, permanent bar from serving as officer or director of any publicly regulated company. Harland Briggs, 12 years federal custody reduced from the maximum recommendation in recognition of his age and a formal admission of culpability submitted through his attorney 2 weeks prior. He had carried something for 40 years and had arrived at 78 at a federal courtroom, too tired to carry it any further. Preston Caldwell, 7 years federal custody with eligibility for reduction contingent on continued cooperation with the ongoing federal investigation. The witness intimidation recording had added 2 years to what would otherwise have been FIP. He had done that to himself in a call he had believed was private. When Preston's sentence was read, I watched him receive it. He did not flinch. He sat straight with his hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on the middle distance, and I recognized in that posture something of myself. The Caldwell method of absorbing a hard thing straight back, still hands face forward. I had braced for relief, for the clean satisfaction of accountability formally assigned. What arrived instead when the words 7 years were spoken about my son was a grief without anger and without self-pity, a father understanding that love does not require you to wish consequences away in order to remain real. Edmund was beside me in the lobby afterward. We walked out onto Pearl Street together into the cold March afternoon, and he placed his hand on my shoulder and left it there while the city moved around us with its magnificent indifference. I looked at the ring on my finger, thought of Eleanor, thought of her letter opened the week after Preston's arrest, her apology for carrying the warning alone, her declaration that she had never stopped being proud of who I was. Each reading had cost me everything I had. Each time I had been glad to pay it. "What happens now?" Edmund asked quietly. I looked up from the ring at the pale March sky above Pearl Street. "Now, IA said we go home. 3 months after a federal sentencing, the world looks different without requiring you to become a different person." The Yale Club on Vanderbilt Avenue was exactly the right room for what this evening needed to be grand enough to feel like an occasion, warm enough to feel like a place where real things get said. 77 members of the Engineer Society had made the trip to New York for the June reunion, and the room had been arranged with round tables that encouraged genuine conversation rather than performance. Edmund and I arrived together. The moment we walked through the door, I felt the room shift, a collective awareness moving through the assembled engineers, like a change in atmospheric pressure. These were people who had followed the story for months, who had read Conrad Ellery's Tribune article on an October morning and understood immediately what was at stake, who had, in their own quiet, professional ways, been waiting to see how it ended. Rita was already there. She crossed the room when she saw Edmund and embraced him without ceremony or preamble. "You owe my brother an enormous apology," she said into his shoulder, "which I am told he has already accepted, which is very like him and slightly infuriating." Edmund laughed, the full, open laugh that had been coming more easily since October. The laugh of a man who has stopped conserving himself for emergencies. "He told me about you," he said, holding her at arm's length. "He did not adequately prepare me." "No one ever is," Rita said, and sat back down with complete satisfaction. Frank Doyle was near the bar, slightly self-conscious in his good jacket, among engineers and attorneys. I crossed to him immediately and shook his hand with both of mine. "You are the reason I am standing in this room tonight," I told him. "Don't be dramatic," he said. "I was assaulted in my own living room," I said. "I am entitled to some drama." His wife Dolores laughed, which set exactly the right tone. Beckett called the room to attention at 7:30, speaking without a microphone in the clear, carrying voice of a man who has learned that confidence projects further than volume. "Two men made a promise in a mine shaft in the Adirondack Mountains in 1984, he said. "They were 20 years old, they were partners, and they believed completely that they were invincible. The promise was simple: if one of us doesn't come back, the other takes care of what's left behind." His voice was steady, carrying something underneath that the steadiness was working carefully to manage. What followed was 40 years of deliberate separation and a systematic effort by powerful people to ensure that promise would never see daylight. The room was entirely still. "The Caldwell-Harlow Initiative," he continued, "is a public-private partnership between Harlow Technologies, the Federal Department of Energy, and the State of New York for the development of the rare earth mineral deposit in the Adirondack Survey area identified and documented by Edmund Harlow and Everett Caldwell in October 1984, and suppressed for 4 decades. He raised his glass. "Valued at $2.4 billion. Full EPA and New York State environmental oversight. Approximately 3,000 permanent jobs in the northern Adirondack region. Named for both of them because the work was always both of theirs." The applause started from Marlo Sinclair Edmonds, former Columbia professor, 81 years old, and still teaching, and spread quickly through the room. Edmonds stood without prepared remarks. He looked around the room slowly, and when he spoke, his voice carried the full weight of everything it had taken to arrive at this evening. "The most important structural element in any system, geological, architectural, or human, is not the strongest piece," he said. "It is the piece that holds when everything around it is designed to make it fail." He raised his glass and looked directly at me. "To Everett Caldwell," he said, "who held." 77 engineers raised their glasses. I looked at the ring on my finger and felt Eleanor in the room, not as grief, but as warmth. The warmth of someone who loved you completely and is pleased with what you became. Later, as the evening softened, Edmund found me at the window overlooking Vanderbilt Avenue. "The Adirondacks," he said quietly. "Section 7. Would you like to go back, just us, one more time?" I looked at him, and at the city moving below, and at the ring that had traveled 40 years to bring us both to this room. "Yes," I said. "I would like that very much." We drove up on a Sunday morning in early October, just the two of us. Beckett had offered to come. Rita had offered to come. Gordon had offered to come, which surprised me and also did not surprise me at all, because Gordon Fitch turns out to be the kind of man who, once he has helped you through something significant, finds it difficult to stop being interested in what happens next. I told them all with genuine gratitude that this particular trip was not one that required company. Some things are meant to be finished by the people who started them. The Adirondacks in October are not the Adirondacks of summer postcards and tourist photographs. The leaves had turned deep amber and rust, and the particular burnt orange that only appears for about 2 weeks each year before the trees give it up entirely. The air had the clean mineral sharpness that I had spent 40 years carrying in my memory without fully realizing I was doing it. We drove north on the Northway with the windows down and the radio off and the comfortable silence of two men who have known each other long enough that silence requires no apology. Edmund navigated from memory. He had not been back in 40 years, and the access roads had changed, and twice we turned around, and once he said something in Edinburgh-accented English that I chose to interpret as mild profanity. But he found it. Of course he found it. Edmund Harlow had spent his entire professional life reading The Shape of the Land, and the land does not change the way people do. The entrance to the old survey site was marked by nothing official, just a break in the tree line where the ground flattened and the rock formations became visible, the strata layered in the particular pattern that both of us recognized without needing to confirm it aloud. We got out of the car and walked to the edge of Section 7 and stood there in the October wind with the valley spread below us. Edmund reached into his jacket pocket and produced a plain silver ring worn smooth, simple, with a small geometric pattern on its surface. My ring. The one he had been wearing for 40 years, the twin of the one on my finger. He held it out without speaking. I took it. I removed the ring from my own finger, Edmund's ring, the one I had carried since 1984, and placed it in his palm. He closed his fingers around it. We stood there at the edge of Section 7 with the valley below us, and the October sky enormous overhead, and the Adirondack wind moving through the trees with its old, indifferent music. And I understood that the promise was not finished when the sentences were handed down, or when the initiative was announced, or when 77 engineers raised their glasses in a room on Vanderbilt Avenue. The promise was finished here. 2 old men, a mountain that had tried to take everything, and a ring finally back where it belonged. If you have stayed with me this long, you already know this is not a story about money or courtrooms. This is a grandpa stories kind of truth, the kind that takes 60 years and a silver ring to finally arrive at. I spent 40 years believing silence was the same as safety. I was wrong. Do not make my mistake. Tell the people you love what they mean to you before a crisis forces the conversation. Do not let pride build walls that grief cannot later climb. I believe God does not waste a single year of a person's life, not even 40 years spent mourning someone who was still alive. Every lost season was preparing the ground for what came next. This is my family story. And every grandpa stories worth telling has a moment where the old man finally understands what he was carrying. This was mine. Every family story worth hearing reminds us of one thing: dignity outlasts betrayal always, if we choose to hold on. If this story moved you, leave a comment telling me which moment stayed with you longest. Share it with someone who needs to hear it today. And subscribe so you never miss the next story. Thank you sincerely for staying until the very end. The stories on this channel contain fictional elements built for educational and storytelling purposes. If this content is not for you, no hard feelings. Choose what serves you best. But if you are still here, I am truly glad you stayed.